Hello and welcome to the one and only edition of the Bitter Truth podcast. I'm your host, Jason Oakes, and tonight I'm going to talk to you about a topic that has destroyed my ability to analyze sports like a normal fan. But first, I have a few disclaimers. 1, I might swear a lot, so my apologies if you're offended by such language. 2, this theory I'm about to talk about is going to make me sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist, but just stick with me. I have some solid numbers to back it up. And number 3, this is something these sports leagues don't want you talking or thinking about a whole lot, so if I wind up dead in a ditch somewhere, don't believe the suicide note because I love myself too much to do that. So without further ado, my theory is this, that the 4 major sports leagues of the US and Canada, the NFL, MLB, NHL, and NBA. It is my deeply held belief that these 4 leagues manipulate the outcomes of their games as well as the regular season standings, for different reasons, of course. Now, the NFL, because it's been by far the most popular of the 4 recently, it can settle for keeping most of its games close until the very end, just so you watch as long as possible. Now, because the NFL is so much more popular than the other 3 leagues, they manipulate their results to favor teams from larger media markets. And by larger media markets, I mean higher populated metro areas. Now, for those of you who haven't already dismissed me as someone who needs to be locked up in the nearest mental hospital, I'd like to explain my rationale for this theory, which is simply that the league commissioners who make millions of dollars a year to run these leagues, the billionaires who own each of your favorite teams, the players who make more money in a year than some of us will in our entire lives, they all see pro sports to varying degrees as a business. In fact, the only people involved who don't see it this way are the fans. Now, since most people involved see professional sports as a business, and the only way to have a successful business is to make money, they need to get as many people as possible going to the games in person, watching the games on TV, and buying merchandise. And it's a lot easier to accomplish this when residents of major metro areas like New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago are excited about their teams because their teams are doing well. Hence why I think they manipulate the results to favor teams from higher populated areas. So now I'd like to get into some of the numbers that I have to back up my theory, and I'm going to be spending a large amount of time talking about Major League Baseball because baseball is the sport I've enjoyed watching longer than any of the others that I'm going to talk about. And as of now, in late August, we're nearing the end of the Major League Baseball regular season, and thus baseball is the sport where the most important games are being played. So I started out by looking at the number of division titles, World Series appearances, and World Series wins claimed since 1993 by current members of the American League East as well as the National League West. The New York Yankees, with a metro population and potential fan base of around 20 million people, the largest metro area in the US and Canada, have won 14 American League East titles and have won 5 of their 7 World Series appearances since 1993, a success rate of about 71%. The Boston Red Sox, with a metro population of about 4.88 million people, 12th biggest metro area, have won 6 American League East titles and have won all 4 of their World Series appearances since 1993. The Tampa Bay Rays, previously known as the Devil Rays, with a supporting population of about 3.14 million people, 19th biggest metro area, have won 2 American League East titles since their establishment in 1998 and have lost their only World Series appearance. The Baltimore Orioles, with a metro population of about 2.8 million, 22nd biggest metro area, have also won 2 American League East titles and haven't had any World Series appearances since 1993. Now, those of you claiming that I've skipped a team would be absolutely right, because the Toronto Blue Jays are a bit of an anomaly, the exception to the rule, so to speak, not only because they're the only Major League Baseball franchise in Canada, but because Toronto's metro population of about 5.93 million people would put it population-wise between New York and Boston, which according to my theory would give them somewhere between 6 and 14 American League East titles, at least 4 more than the 2 they actually have. It would also give them 4 or 5 World Series wins in 5 or 6 appearances, as opposed to their 1 win in their lone appearance during that period. But I'm not very worried about this not fitting in with my theory because there are exceptions to every rule. So here are those numbers from the American League East again, so you can see them all at the same time. You'll notice that the Yankees and the Red Sox undoubtedly the two most historic teams in the AL East, also happen to reside in the two most populated American metro areas. Because of this, they've combined for 20 of the 26 division titles, 11 of the 13 World Series appearances, and 9 of the 10 World Series championships won by teams from the current AL East. Now on to the National League West and the Los Angeles Dodgers, who play in the nation's second biggest media market. Their metro population and potential fan base of around 13.3 million people has earned them 11 National League West titles, and according to my theory, a shocking 0 World Series wins and only 2 appearances since 1993. Then comes the San Francisco Giants, who play in the nation's 6th biggest media market if you take the entire Bay Area, San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose combined. Their metro population of 6.73 million people has earned them 5 National League West titles and 3 World Series wins in 4 appearances. The Arizona Diamondbacks, playing in the 13th ranked Phoenix metro area with a population of about 4.86 million, also have 5 National League West titles to go along with the World Series victory over the Yankees in their lone appearance in 2001. The San Diego Padres, with a metro population of about 3.34 million, 18th largest metro area, have 4 division titles and have lost their only World Series appearance in that time. The Colorado Rockies, playing in the 20th biggest metro area with a population of around 2.93 million people, have no division titles and have lost their only World Series appearance in 2007, having not won a single World Series game. In fact, the only exception to the rule here is that the Dodgers have won 0 World Series titles since 1993, a fact that Major League Baseball is desperately trying to change considering the fact that the Dodgers have been in the World Series the past 2 seasons and have won 7 consecutive NL West titles. Here are those numbers from the National League West again so you can see them all together as well. Notice that the Dodgers and Giants, the two most historic teams in the NL West, also happen to reside in the 2 most populated metro areas in the division. While the results aren't as slanted toward them as the AL East is toward the Yankees and the Red Sox, those two have combined for 16 of the 25 division titles, 6 of the 9 World Series appearances, and 3 of the 4 World Series championships won by teams from the current NL West. Next, I took the lowest populated city in each division, Baltimore for the AL East and Denver for the NL West, to see how many times those teams finished ahead of their division foes in the standings. As expected, both the Orioles and the Rockies finished ahead of their division foes from higher populated cities fewer times than they did against the teams from the lower populated cities, with Toronto once again being the notable exception. In the case of the Orioles, they finished ahead of the Rays 14 times, the Red Sox 7 times, the Blue Jays 9 times, and the Yankees 5 times. As for the Rockies, they finished ahead of the Padres 14 times, the Diamondbacks 7 times, the Giants also 7 times, and they finished ahead of the Dodgers only twice. Next, I thought it would be fun to compare the 4 expansion teams from the 1990s. The Miami Marlins, formerly the Florida Marlins, with a metro population of about 6.2 million, have never won their division, but they've made up for this by winning the World Series both times they've appeared. And once again, the Arizona Diamondbacks, with Metro Phoenix's population of about 4.86 million, have won 5 division titles and have won the World Series the only time they appeared back in 2001. Finally, we have the Tampa Bay Rays and the Colorado Rockies. With their relatively small metro populations of 3.14 million and 2.93 million respectively, these two teams have gotten the short end of the stick even among the expansion teams, with both teams having lost their only World Series appearance. Now before I move on to the NHL, I want to examine Major League Baseball's narrative that the higher altitude here in Denver is the only explanation for bad Rockies pitching and thus the non-competitive teams they've had through most of their history. I've lived in Colorado my whole life, except for the 6 years that I served in the Air Force, and I had never heard of altitude being an issue for the pitchers on any of Colorado's minor league baseball teams before the Rockies. Of course, I was only 7 years old on the day of the Rockies' first ever game, so in the interest of doing all the research I could, I asked my dad, who with a few exceptions has also lived in either Colorado or Utah for his entire life, and he couldn't remember altitude being an issue for the pitchers on any of Colorado's minor league teams as well. So I went online and found an interesting study that was posted just before the 2007 World Series between the Rockies and the Boston Red Sox. For those of you who are interested in more of the physics behind this phenomenon, the article can be found here, but for those of you who aren't interested in the physics, I'll try to sum it up as best I can. For those of you who have visited the Mile High City and maybe tried to climb a staircase too quickly at one of our beautiful, if stupidly named sports venues, I'm looking at you, Broncos. Either call it Mile High Stadium or give it a fucking corporate name. All the names the new stadium has had sound really stupid. Anyway, if you've ever visited here from somewhere else, you probably tended to lose your breath a little bit quicker here than you did wherever you came from, because the air here is a little bit thinner than most other parts of the country, and the study I found online confirmed that baseballs are hit 10% farther and pitched 1 mile per hour faster here than at all other baseball stadiums. But that's not all there is to the story. In addition to being thinner, the air here is quite a bit drier than in most other parts of the country. The physicist who did the study and wrote the article stated quite interestingly that the dry air here in Denver is actually thicker than more humid air found elsewhere in the country. So you could logically conclude that the dry air here negates at least some of that 10% additional distance. Now, the article didn't actually say whether the dry air negates all of that 10%, but here's where I risk sounding crazy again. I think that it actually negates the entire 10%, and that Major League Baseball asked the author of the article not to mention that so that they could keep peddling this narrative that altitude is what's to explain for the Rockies' bad pitching and their lack of championship chances. Now let's say for a second that you still believe this altitude narrative because Major League Baseball's been shoving it into your ear hole at every possible fucking opportunity for the last 26 years. Consider this. If this were actually true, do you think that Rockies pitchers who live here at least half the year and play half their games here, do you really truly think they'd be the pitchers most affected by this? No, they'd get used to it pretty quickly, and the pitchers most affected by it would be the visitors who play at most 10 games a year here. But since this is a bunch of propaganda that the powers that be at Major League Baseball pulled out of their asses 27 years ago, the Rockies, who play in one of the lowest populated cities in the league, their pitchers are the ones that struggle. In fact, the only Major League no-hitter ever thrown in Denver came in September of 1996, but was not thrown by a Rockies pitcher, but instead by, drumroll please, Hideo Nomo of the goddamn Los Angeles Dodgers. I propose that this is nothing more than propaganda Major League Baseball created to protect their cash cows, the Yankees, the Red Sox, the Dodgers, and the Giants. This whole altitude narrative is a myth, it's a giant steaming load of bullshit, and it needs to die a very quick, very painful death. Okay, so now I'm gonna move on to the NHL and how my theory plays out in that league. But I'm not as upset about it happening in the NHL as I am about it happening in Major League Baseball for 2 reasons. 1, it's not happening as abundantly as I thought it was. And 2, the trend seems to have reversed itself, at least for the time being. At this time, I'd like to provide a little bit of background for you. The NHL has had significant labor issues since the summer of 1994. In fact, they've had 3 lockouts during that time, during which each franchise has lost 152 out of a possible 248 games. In other words, they lost about 61% of the games they could have played during those 3 seasons had there been no labor issues. And I want to make an important distinction here. All 3 times when the NHL lost games due to labor stoppages, they weren't player strikes where the players essentially refused to come to work in hope of better working conditions. These were lockouts initiated by the owners. The first of these lockouts occurred during the 1994-95 season, when each team lost 36 games, or about 43% of their season. Since this was a lockout and the team owners, as well as the league commissioner, undoubtedly saw it coming, it should be no surprise that the New York Rangers, the most popular team in the most populated city in the league, won the Stanley Cup final the previous spring, breaking a 54-year championship drought. No doubt a little bit of early goodwill to as many fans as possible. In the aftermath of the 94-95 lockout, the NHL had 3 of its franchises relocate to larger cities. But I'm not too upset about this because the first of these relocations created the team that I currently root for. In the summer of 1995, the Quebec Nordiques moved from Quebec City, Quebec, population of about 800,000, to Denver, Colorado, population of about 2.93 million. The franchise is now known as the Colorado Avalanche and has won 2 Stanley Cups since the relocation, creating a passionate fan base in a much larger city. The following summer, the old Winnipeg Jets moved from Winnipeg, Manitoba, population of about 778,000, to Phoenix, Arizona, population of about 4.86 million. This relocation didn't pay off as well for the NHL, as the franchise initially known as the Phoenix Coyotes, now the Arizona Coyotes, haven't won a single Stanley Cup since the relocation. In the summer of 1997, the Hartford Whalers moved from Hartford, Connecticut, population of about 1.21 million, to Raleigh, North Carolina, population of about 1.36 million. This relocation paid off a little bit better for the NHL than the previous one did, as the franchise now known as the Carolina Hurricanes won the Stanley Cup in 2006. Now, the population jump of about 150,000 from the last relocation wasn't anywhere near as great as the previous 2, but you get my point. In all 3 instances, the NHL expanded its potential fan base, with a team from a small city in Canada or the northern US moving to a much larger populated city farther south in a non-traditional hockey market. In order to judge how much the NHL favors its teams from higher populated metro areas, specifically the 3 highest populated American metro areas, New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago, I looked at the number of playoff appearances, Stanley Cup final appearances, and Stanley Cup wins by the 6 teams from those 3 areas: the New York Rangers, New York Islanders, New Jersey Devils, Los Angeles Kings, Anaheim Ducks, and Chicago Blackhawks. Between 1995 and 2004, these 6 teams combined to occupy 26 of 60, or about 43% of the possible playoff spots, as well as combining for 5 Stanley Cup final appearances and winning the Stanley Cup 3 times. The New Jersey Devils were the most dominant of these teams during that era, making the playoffs 9 out of those 10 seasons, while making 4 appearances in the Stanley Cup final and winning 3 of them. In late 2004 and early 2005, the NHL had another lockout which cost the league the entire season. This made it the first and, to date, the only North American sports league to lose an entire season because of a labor issue. In the 14 seasons since that infamous lockout, the NHL has been understandably desperate to appeal to teams and fans from higher populated areas. During that time, those same 6 teams have occupied 50 of a possible 84 playoff spots, a jump from 43% to 60%, as well as making 8 appearances in the Stanley Cup final and winning 6 of them. Like I mentioned before, those 6 teams weren't quite as frustratingly dominant as it felt like they were at the time, but the interesting thing about those numbers is that 7 of the 8 Stanley Cup final appearances and 5 of the 6 Stanley Cup wins those teams collected came within 3 years on either side of the 2012-2013 lockout that cost each team 34 games, or approximately 41% of the season. So that's all I have to say about the NHL, but before I get into the meat of my NFL monologue, I want to take a minute to address the national anthem protests that made headlines in the NFL about 2 to 3 years ago. But first, some background information for those who aren't familiar with the situation. Back in 2016, then San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick started refusing to stand for the national anthem that's played before games, protesting racial injustice in this country as well as police brutality toward minority citizens. As his cause continued to gain more and more attention and more NFL players followed his lead, Kaepernick and his fellow protesters caught a lot of criticism, most notably from President Donald Trump, who said that they should be fired for not standing for the national anthem, among many others who claimed that what they were doing was un-American and that they were disrespecting the military members who fight for our freedom. And that's exactly what I want to address here, because as a 6-year veteran of the Air Force, I didn't see their actions as disrespectful toward the military at all, nor did I see them as un-American. In fact, those of us who remember our American history know that in the 1770s, when Ben Franklin, George Washington, and all their peers were under the authority of King George of England, and they started to see things happening that they didn't approve of, they took action and they did what was necessary to change those things that they didn't like. So I would argue that the actions of Kaepernick and his fellow protesters displayed the very attitude that founded this country in the first place, and thus were more American than if they had just sat back and done nothing. But I should mention that those were my personal views and that I don't claim to speak for any current or former military member other than myself. So now to quote Forrest Gump.
And that's all I have to say about that.
At this point, New England Patriots fans are probably going to want to tune out because I spend the majority of the rest of this podcast explaining why I hate your team because they're a bunch of overrated, talentless hacks. And yes, Tom Brady is included in that group, possibly the most overrated, talentless hack of them all. Let's start out by examining how often the Patriots have finished a season with a winning record, more wins than losses, how often they've finished with 10 or more wins, how often they've appeared in the Super Bowl, and how often they've won the Super Bowl. At this time, I'd like to offer my take on the Deflategate scandal that rocked the NFL about 4 to 5 years ago. But first, as usual, I'd like to offer a little bit of background for those who are unfamiliar with or have forgotten the details of the scandal. After the Patriots defeated the Seattle Seahawks in Super Bowl 49, the vast majority of media members that covered the NFL at the time were not crediting the Patriots and Roger Goodell's golden boy, Tom Brady, for winning the game, but instead criticizing Seattle's offensive play callers for calling a pass play from the 1-yard line, instead of handing the ball to Marshawn Lynch, arguably the league's best running back at the time, and letting him score what would have been the game-winning touchdown. This criticism continued for the next few months into early May when the NFL-backed Wells Report was released, which apparently implicated Tom Brady as well as a couple of Patriots equipment guys for deliberately underinflating footballs prior to the previous season's AFC Championship game against the Indianapolis Colts. Roger Goodell subsequently suspended Brady for 4 games without pay, a suspension that was appealed by the NFL Players Association, setting off an almost year-and-a-half legal battle. As the legal battle dragged on and more details of the Wells Report came out, NFL fans and media members outside of New England started to side with Brady and question why Goodell was so aggressively pursuing this suspension. Now, I can't believe I'm about to defend Tom Brady, but I don't think the guy actually did anything wrong in this case. I think the whole charade was a giant load of bullshit orchestrated by Roger Goodell for 2 purposes. First, it got his golden boy Tom Brady back in the spotlight, with the media saying more and more nice things about him as time went on, as if they didn't do enough of that during the previous 14 years to make you want to vomit profusely. And second, it allowed Goodell to paint himself, in the public eye at least, as Tom Brady's opposition, thus convincing most NFL fans and media members that he doesn't love Tom Brady as much as he actually does. Finally, I want to talk about why I believe my Denver Broncos appear to be such a horrible football team right now. The reason is simply that the Broncos have always been a thorn in Tom Brady's side. Denver, due to its mile-high altitude and crazy raucous fans, has always been the one place that Tom Brady cannot win when the Broncos have a half-decent team. Brady has lost 7 of the 11 games he's played in Denver during his career, including 3 games in the playoffs, a divisional round matchup after the 2005 season, which was the first time in 11 games that the Patriots lost in the playoffs under Bill Belichick and Tom Brady, as well as the AFC Championship games after the 2013 and 2015 seasons, the only 2 losses which have kept the Patriots from going to the Super Bowl each of the past 6 seasons. Brady's only 4 wins in Denver have come when the Broncos were quarterbacked by Danny Kanell in 2003, Tim Tebow in 2011, Trevor Siemian in 2016, and Brock Osweiler in 2017. Not exactly Hall of Fame quarterbacks, although Tebow was rather legendary around here during that 2011 season for leading the Broncos to a number of comeback wins, as well as a playoff berth and a playoff win over the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, if you've stuck with me this far, you may be thinking, well, Jason, this is all interesting information, but it's all circumstantial. None of this would ever hold up in court. And to that I would say, you're exactly right. You see, these leagues absolutely don't want you to have any physical evidence that would prove my theory beyond a reasonable doubt, because that would totally screw up their business plan. If sports fans knew that this was going on, I'm betting that the vast majority of us would completely stop watching games, utterly disgusted by the dishonesty and greed that such a business plan would suggest, and thus the owners and commissioners would have to say goodbye to the ridiculous amounts of money that they're making off of us. So now you may be asking yourself why I cling so tightly to this belief if I can't actually prove that it's happening. So now I need to explain where I'm at mentally as a sports fan right now. After watching my Rockies be the embarrassment of Major League Baseball for most of the last 27 years, I finally got to watch them make the playoffs in back-to-back seasons for the first time in franchise history. And I find it very suspicious that after last season, when they seriously challenged the Dodgers or Giants for a division title for the very first time, that they suddenly can't win an important game to save their lives and have numerous key players injured or ineffective for long stretches of the season. I've also spent the majority of the last 15 years watching my Avalanche play mediocre hockey at best, including a few seasons ago when they finished at the bottom of the National Hockey League standings by a wide margin. And as if that weren't bad enough, I've now watched my Broncos become a complete dumpster fire over the last several seasons, having recently completed their first back-to-back losing seasons in 46 years. While the Patriots, supported by a New England population over 5 times larger than Metro Denver, have gone on to become one of the most dominant teams that North American sports fans have ever seen. So yes, you could call me a bitter sports fan, and you'd probably be right to do so. But believe me when I tell you that it's much easier to believe that your teams are losing because the system is rigged against them, rather than they're losing because they're just that bad. On that note, I've said just about all I need to say. If you're still with me, hopefully I've either entertained you or given you something new to think about. This has been The Bitter Truth according to Jason Oakes. Peace out.